What we got Scott Ritter back with us because I wanted to get his expert opinion and have him explain this story for us. So this is a big story from today. Revealed NATO plan to get U.S. troops to the front line to fight Russia. Alliance prepares for rapid deployment of American soldiers amid fears Moscow is plotting major war with Europe. NATO leaders previously agreed to ready 300,000 troops for rapid deployment. So this is U.S. troops are going to go fight Russia? Tell me what this means.
Well, right now, the United States has approximately 100,000 troops in Europe. That's not enough to wage a war today. But it's enough for a presence, a tripwire. But if there was a war with Russia, NATO would need to mobilize a considerable amount of combat-capable troops. They simply don't have them today. This 300,000 rapid deployment force exists only on paper at the moment. But one of the problems NATO has is because it's a peacetime military alliance, how do you get troops from the port to Eastern Europe? All the NATO logistics that existed in the past got troops from NATO ports or NATO airfields in Western Europe to Germany, which was the front line. West Germany was the front line with East Germany, the Soviet Union, etc. But now that the NATO has expanded to the Russian frontier with Poland, the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, there isn't infrastructure to support this, and there's insufficient troops in. We used to have 300,000 troops in Europe and could deploy another 250, 300,000 within 10 days. Today we have 100,000 and we don't have the ability to surge forces in. And so any reinforcement to take place is we'd be bringing troops over on ships. They'll arrive in ports. One of the big ports they would arrive would be in Hamburg or Antwerp. Previously, they'd get off the ports and ride on German highways to a German front line. Now they have to cross borders. NATO hasn't figured out how to move troops from one nation to the next, how to do customs clearance, how to avoid bottlenecks. Two, none of their highways or bridges have been reinforced to handle large-scale military movements. So even once they allowed it to happen, the infrastructure would collapse. Three, there's no redundancy, meaning that if there's one bridge over the river that you got to get your army over and the Russians blow up that bridge, you don't have a plan B. D, how do you get troops that you can get them to Poland, but how do you get them to Romania? How do you get them to Finland now that Finland joined? And so what NATO's doing now, they just did an exercise for instance, in Norway, landing a couple hundred American and Finnish and Norwegian Marines. And they wanted to get them to Finland, to get them from Norway over the mountains, down through Sweden, up into Finland to the front line. They realized the infrastructure doesn't exist. So if Russia was to go to war with Finland, NATO couldn't reinforce Finland, even though they promised them they could. So they have to spend money now building superhighways, new bridges, port facilities, and then they have to plan. What happens when Antwerp no longer exists because the Russians took it out? Where do you land? What's your plan B port? And this is what this plan is right now. NATO is saying, we can't do this, so we have to come up with a plan to do it. The bad news is it makes it look like NATO and Russia are going to war. You know what the good news is, Jimmy? They can't do it. It's too expensive.
Is that to scare us?
So why? Yeah. So has Putin been threatening to go to war with these smaller countries?
Putin has been saying the exact. All Putin has done is defeat NATO and their proxy Ukraine in Ukraine. Putin has humiliated NATO. The defeat of NATO's technological superiority. You remember when the Leopard tank was the magic weapon?
Yeah.
But they found out that it burns. The Abrams was the magic tank. Oh, it burns too. There's no such thing as a magic weapon. All the weapons that the West thought would give it the technological edge over the Russians don't. HIMARS, that multiple launch rocket system, it uses a GPS guided warhead. The Russians jam it. The HIMARS doesn't hit what it's supposed to hit. The same thing with ATACMS. It gets jammed. There are no magic weapons, and this has humiliated NATO. And the other thing NATO realizes, and General Cavoli, who's the U.S. commander of ground forces, said, NATO had never imagined the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine. They weren't prepared to suffer the casualties for the sustainability factors. And so what's happened is that NATO realizes it can't fight the Russians, that the Russians have the better army, the better way of doing this. And so NATO now is screaming. They have to turn to their taxpayers and say, you got to pump up hundreds of billions of dollars now to rebuild our military. And the taxpayers are saying, why? Why are we going to do that? Well, because the Russians are threatening to invade. The Russians aren't threatening to invade. All Russia's done is beat NATO in a war that NATO started.
So why then would this? Why? So it says revealed. So that means that on purpose, NATO revealed this plan
For us to be scared.
And who's that? Is that for us to be scared? What's this for?
Well, I think the reality is somebody in NATO went, this is insane, and they revealed it because remember, this is just paper. These are just words. Those 300,000 troops don't exist. They haven't recruited them yet. They haven't trained them yet. Germany, to give you an example, has said that they're going to expand this battalion they have, a couple hundred men in, I think, Lithuania, to a brigade of 4,000 men. Oh, they're supposed to make everybody scared on that. It may not happen because Germany has to first recruit the troops who agreed to be stationed overseas. They can't just take a brigade out of their army and station in Lithuania. The Constitution prohibits that. So they have to recruit 4,000 Germans who agree to be stationed overseas. And then they have to equip them, which means they have to build new tanks and armored vehicles, except they can't because America blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which brought in the cheap gas, which allowed the steel plants to produce steel. Those steel plants had to shut down because they can't afford to produce steel. Germany can't make steel to make tanks. They can't make the tanks to make to build the battalions. This is all of NATO is a disaster like this. It's just a one big giant cluster, you know what. And so I think what happened here is somebody looked in there and said, we need to nip this madness in the bud. Let's reveal this plan so that Scott Ritter can mock it on Jimmy Dore's show and kill it.
And so that's what this is. So this isn't anything to actually be afraid of.
We can't do it. That's like me, Jimmy. That's like you saying, okay, Jimmy, tonight I'm announcing that I'm going to build a space rocket and I'm going to go to Mars. And you're like, oh my God, if Scott goes to Mars, that'll disrupt the universal balance. We're all